What if I told you that the most aggressive trade war in modern American history isn't actually about trade at all, and that the country taking the biggest hit isn't America's rival across the Pacific, but rather its closest ally and neighbor to the north? Right now, something absolutely extraordinary is happening in the world of global economics and geopolitics, something that most mainstream media outlets are completely missing. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why Donald Trump is slapping Canada with tariffs that dwarf anything being levied against China. And trust me when I say this, the real reason goes so much deeper than anything you've heard on cable news or read in the newspapers. Let's start with the numbers because they are genuinely shocking. When you look at the tariff rates being imposed on Canadian goods, we're talking about levels that haven't been seen between these two nations since before World War II. Meanwhile, China, the country that has been portrayed as America's greatest economic adversary for the past decade, the nation accused of stealing intellectual property, manipulating currency, and engaging in unfair trade practices on a massive scale, is facing tariffs that are comparatively moderate. On the surface, this makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Canada and the United States share the longest undefended border in the world. They are partners in NATO, in the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, in NORAD, and they've been each other's largest trading partners for generations. So why would any American president choose to hit Canada harder than China? Why would you punish your friend more severely than your competitor? Now here's where things get really interesting, and this is the part that nobody is talking about. Stay with me on this because once you understand the strategy behind these decisions, you'll never look at international trade the same way again. The conventional explanation that you've probably heard goes something like this. Trump is using tariffs to force Canada to address issues like fentanyl trafficking, illegal immigration, and the trade deficit. These are real concerns, legitimate policy areas that deserve attention, and they've been used as the public justification for these aggressive measures. But if you actually dig into the data, if you really analyze what's happening at the ground level, you'll quickly realize that these explanations don't hold water when compared to the scale of the tariffs being imposed. Fentanyl coming across the Canadian border represents a tiny fraction of what's entering from Mexico or being shipped from China. Illegal crossings from Canada are statistically insignificant compared to the southern border. And the trade deficit with Canada? It fluctuates year to year and isn't fundamentally different from America's trade relationships with dozens of other countries that aren't facing anywhere near these tariff levels. So if it's not really about drugs, immigration, or trade deficits, then what is it actually about? This is where we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture, at the grand strategic chess game being played on the world stage right now. The first thing you need to understand is that Canada is sitting on something that the United States desperately needs, something that is going to become the most valuable commodity of the 21st century, possibly even more important than oil was in the 20th century. I'm talking about critical minerals, rare earth elements, and natural resources that are absolutely essential for modern technology, for military equipment, for electric vehicles, for semiconductors, and for artificial intelligence infrastructure. Canada has one of the largest deposits of these materials anywhere on Earth. We're talking about lithium, cobalt, nickel, uranium, potassium, and dozens of other elements that are critical for everything from batteries to fighter jets. Right now, China controls approximately 70% of the global rare earth supply chain. They've spent decades strategically acquiring mines and processing facilities around the world, and they've built a near monopoly on these materials that gives them enormous leverage over the United States and its allies. But here's the thing that changes everything. Canada could break that monopoly. The geological surveys have been done. The deposits have been identified. Canada has the potential to become the Western world's primary source of critical minerals, completely reshaping the global balance of power. But here's the problem. Developing these resources requires massive investment, infrastructure development, and policy coordination on a scale that Canada hasn't been willing or able to undertake on its own. And this is exactly where the tariffs come into play. Think about it from a strategic perspective. If you're the United States and you want to secure your supply chains for the next 50 years, you need guaranteed access to these Canadian resources. You need them developed quickly. You need them developed with American investment and American involvement. And you need to ensure that China doesn't come in and lock up those resources first. How do you make that happen? You apply pressure. You create urgency. You force negotiations that wouldn't happen otherwise. And the most powerful tool you have for applying that kind of pressure is tariffs. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. Surely there are easier ways to get what you want from an ally. Surely diplomacy, negotiation, and mutual cooperation would be more effective than economic warfare. And in theory, you'd be right. But the reality of international relations is far more complicated than that. And here's where the second layer of this story becomes crucial. Canada has been playing a very delicate balancing act for years, trying to maintain its close relationship with the United States while also cultivating economic ties with China. Canadian politicians have been reluctant to choose sides in the emerging great power competition, preferring to keep their options open and maximize their trading opportunities with both powers. This might seem like sensible policy from Ottawa's perspective, but from Washington's point of view, it represents a serious strategic liability. Consider what happened with Huawei. When the United States began pressuring its allies to exclude Chinese technology from their 5G networks, citing national security concerns, Canada hesitated. While Australia, the United Kingdom, and others moved relatively quickly to ban Huawei equipment, Canada dragged its feet for years, caught between American pressure and Chinese threats. This isn't an isolated incident. Time and again, Canada has tried to chart a middle course, and time and again, American policymakers have grown frustrated with what they see as a lack of commitment to the alliance. The tariffs on Canada aren't just about resources or trade deficits. They're about forcing a choice. They're about ending the era of strategic ambiguity and compelling Canada to fully align with American interests. And here's the genius of using tariffs rather than direct political pressure. Tariffs create economic pain that affects ordinary Canadians, that impacts businesses and workers and voters. That economic pain creates political pressure on Canadian leaders to reach a deal, to make concessions, to align more closely with American priorities that its leverage, pure and simple, deployed against a country that doesn't have the economic size or the geopolitical alternatives to effectively resist. But wait, you might say, why doesn't the United States use the same strategy against China? Why hit Canada with 100% tariffs while going relatively easier on China? This is where the analysis gets really fascinating, and I promise you, the answer reveals something profound about how power actually works in the modern world. The truth is that China can hurt the United States back in ways that Canada simply cannot. China has the manufacturing capacity, the market size, and the strategic depth to absorb tariffs and retaliate effectively. When America imposes tariffs on China, China can respond by restricting exports of critical materials, by dumping products in third markets to undercut American companies, by devaluing its currency, or by targeting politically sensitive American industries like agriculture in ways that create domestic political problems for any president. China also holds over $1 trillion in American government debt, giving it additional leverage that Canada simply doesn't possess. Canada, by contrast, is economically dependent on the United States in a way that makes effective retaliation almost impossible. Over 75% of Canadian exports go to the American market. The Canadian economy is deeply integrated with the American economy, and any trade war between the two countries hurts Canada far more than it hurts the United States. This asymmetry means that aggressive tariffs on Canada are low risk and high reward from an American perspective, while similar tariffs on China carry much greater risks and uncertain outcomes. There's also a domestic political calculation at work here, and this is something that often gets overlooked in purely economic analyses. The American public has very different perceptions of Canada and China. China has been portrayed as an adversary, a threat, a rival that plays unfair and cheats the system. Tariffs on China are popular with large segments of the American electorate. Canada, however, has traditionally been seen as a friendly neighbor, an ally, a country that shares American values and culture. Harsh tariffs on Canada might seem cruel or unnecessary to many Americans. So why would a politically savvy president take that risk? The answer lies in how the tariffs are framed. By linking the tariffs to issues like fentanyl and border security, the administration creates a narrative that justifies the aggressive measures. It's not about punishing a friend. It's about protecting American lives and enforcing American sovereignty. The actual strategic objectives, securing resources and forcing alignment, remain hidden behind this more palatable public explanation. And this is something you'll see over and over again in international relations. The stated reason for a policy is rarely the real reason, and understanding the difference is key to understanding how the world actually works. Let me give you a historical example that illustrates this pattern perfectly. In 1971, President Richard Nixon imposed a 10% import surcharge on all goods entering the United States, including goods from allied nations like Japan and Western Europe. The stated reason was to address the trade deficit and protect American jobs. But the real objective was to force a restructuring of the global monetary system, to end the Bretton Woods Agreement and the gold standard, and to reshape the entire architecture of international finance in ways that would benefit American interests. The tariffs were a pressure tactic, a way of forcing negotiations that wouldn't otherwise happen, and they worked exactly as intended. Within months, America's allies had agreed to a new monetary framework that gave the United States unprecedented flexibility in managing its currency and its economy. What we're seeing today with Canada is the same playbook, adapted for a new era and new strategic objectives. The tariffs aren't an end in themselves, they're a means to an end. They're designed to create pain, to generate urgency, and to force outcomes that align with American strategic interests. Now let's talk about what those outcomes might look like, because this is where the story gets really consequential for the future of North America and the global economy. One possibility is a comprehensive renegotiation of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade deal that replaced NAFTA during Trump's first term. That agreement is up for review in 2026, and there's every indication that the administration wants significant changes. Those changes could include provisions that give the United States greater access to Canadian resources, that require Canadian compliance with American foreign policy objectives, and that further integrate the two economies in ways that reduce Canada's room for independent action. The tariffs we're seeing now could be positioning for that renegotiation, establishing leverage that will be traded away in exchange for Canadian concessions. Another possibility, and this is one that very few analysts are discussing publicly, is a fundamental restructuring of North American security arrangements. For decades, Canada has benefited from American military protection while spending relatively little on its own defense. Canadian military spending has consistently been among the lowest in NATO as a percentage of GDP. American policymakers across both parties have grown increasingly frustrated with this arrangement, particularly as the geopolitical environment has become more dangerous. The tariffs could be part of a broader effort to force Canada to increase its defense spending, to take on greater responsibilities within the alliance, and to accept a closer integration with American military planning and operations. There's also the energy dimension, which is absolutely crucial and often underappreciated. Canada is America's largest supplier of imported oil and natural gas. Canadian energy powers American homes, American factories, and American vehicles. But Canada has also been developing plans to diversify its energy exports, to build pipelines and terminals that would allow it to sell its resources to Asian markets, including China. From a purely Canadian perspective, this makes sense. Why be dependent on a single customer when you can have multiple buyers competing for your products? But from an American strategic perspective, this diversification represents a threat. It would reduce American leverage over Canada while potentially benefiting American adversaries. The tariffs can be understood, in part, as a way of discouraging this diversification. By making the American market more difficult to access, they paradoxically make Canada more dependent on reaching a deal with the United States. If Canada can't sell its goods to America without crippling tariffs, and if the infrastructure to sell to Asia hasn't been built yet, then Canada is trapped. Its only option is to negotiate, to make concessions, to align itself more closely with American preferences. The tariffs are a squeeze play, designed to limit Canadian options and force Canadian compliance. I want to pause here and address something that I know some viewers might be feeling. This analysis might seem cynical, even harsh. Canada is a close ally, a country that has stood with the United States through world wars and cold wars and everything in between. Treating them this way might seem unfair or even cruel. And on a certain level, you'd be right. International relations can be brutal, and the strong often take advantage of the weak, even among allies. But here's the thing we need to understand. In the world of great power competition, sentimentality is a luxury that nations can rarely afford. The United States is facing genuine challenges: a rising China that seeks to reshape the global order, a revisionist Russia that is disrupting European security, and a global economy in which critical resources and supply chains have become matters of national security. In this environment, American policymakers are making hard-headed calculations about how to position the United States for the coming decades. Those calculations don't leave much room for sentimentality about long-time friendships or shared history. Canada, for its part, needs to recognize the reality of its situation. It's a medium-sized power living next to a superpower, and it doesn't have the luxury of strategic independence. Its choices are constrained by geography, by economics, and by the fundamental asymmetry in power between Ottawa and Washington. The sooner Canadian leaders accept this reality and adjust their policies accordingly, the better positioned Canada will be to navigate the turbulent decades ahead. Now let's zoom out even further and consider what all of this means for the global economy and the international order. Because what's happening between the United States and Canada isn't an isolated event. It's part of a much larger pattern that's reshaping how nations relate to each other in the 21st century. For decades, the world operated under a system of relatively free trade, open markets, and economic interdependence. This system was championed by the United States, which saw it as a way to promote prosperity, spread democracy, and bind potential adversaries into a web of mutual interests that would make conflict less likely. That system is now breaking down. The era of globalization as we knew it is ending, and a new era of economic nationalism, strategic competition, and trade weaponization is taking its place. The tariffs on Canada are a symptom of this larger transformation. They reflect a world in which trade is no longer just about economics, it's about power. Countries are weaponizing economic relationships, using tariffs and sanctions and investment restrictions as tools of statecraft, as ways of advancing strategic objectives that go far beyond simple profit and loss. And in this new world, alliances and partnerships are becoming transactional rather than principled. The question isn't whether you share values or history with another country. It's whether that country is useful to you, whether it can help you achieve your objectives, and whether you have the leverage to make it do what you want. This shift has profound implications for every country on Earth, not just Canada. Middle powers everywhere are facing the same dilemma. How do you maintain your sovereignty and your interests when great powers are demanding that you choose sides? How do you navigate a world where economic relationships are weaponized and trade deals are used as tools of coercion? These are questions that European countries, Asian countries, and countries throughout the global South are all grappling with, and there are no easy answers. For the United States, the strategy of using tariffs to coerce allies carries risks as well as rewards. In the short term, it might achieve its objectives, forcing Canada and other countries to make concessions and align with American priorities. But in the long term, it could undermine the trust and goodwill that has been built up over generations, making allies less reliable and less willing to cooperate when it really matters. Countries that feel bullied and coerced don't make loyal partners, and the United States might find that its aggressive tactics have created resentment and resistance that come back to haunt it down the road. There's also the question of what happens if this strategy becomes normalized, if other countries adopt the same approach and start using tariffs as weapons in their own disputes. The result could be a fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocs, each trying to secure its own supply chains and punish its rivals. Trade would become less efficient, prices would rise, and the gains from globalization that lifted billions out of poverty over the past few decades would be reversed. This might be a price that some strategists are willing to pay, but it's a price that ordinary people around the world would ultimately bear. As we come to the end of this analysis, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways that I hope will stick with you long after you've finished watching this video. First, never take political explanations at face value. When a government says it's imposing tariffs because of fentanyl or illegal immigration, that might be true in part, but it's rarely the whole story. The real reasons for major policy decisions are usually more complex, more strategic, and less publicly palatable than the explanations offered to the press and the public. Second, understand that we're living through a fundamental transformation in how the global economy works, that he rules that governed international trade for the past several decades are being rewritten, and the new rules are going to be very different. Economic interdependence is no longer seen as an unalloyed good. It's increasingly seen as a vulnerability to be managed and exploited. Countries that understand this shift and adapt to it will thrive. Those that don't will struggle. Third, geography is destiny, now more than ever. Canada's location next to the United States gives it enormous advantages in terms of trade and security, but it also limits its options and makes it vulnerable to American pressure. The same logic applies to other countries and other regions. Your neighbors matter, and the power relationships in your immediate vicinity will shape your choices whether you like it or not. And fourth, watch the resources. The great power competition of the 21st century is going to be fought over critical minerals, over rare earth elements, over the materials needed for technology and clean energy and military systems. Countries that control these resources will have leverage. Countries that depend on others for these resources will be vulnerable. This is why Canada matters so much, why the Arctic matters so much, and why you're going to see more and more conflicts over resources in the years to come. What we're witnessing right now between the United States and Canada is just the beginning of a much larger story. The tariffs are the opening move in a game that will play out over years and decades. The stakes are nothing less than the shape of the global order for the rest of the century. I hope this video has given you a deeper understanding of what's really happening and why. If you found this analysis valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos where we dive deep into the geopolitics and economics that are shaping our world. Share this with someone who needs to understand what's really going on behind the headlines. The truth is out there for those willing to look for it. And together, we can make sense of an increasingly complex and uncertain world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.